last night. We welcome you back. If it's your first time here, we're glad you're here. We have Richard Walker currently from Nashville, Tennessee, and he's speaking to us this morning in 2 sessions and this afternoon in 2 sessions. They kind of run together sessions, but on creation, myth or miracle, where does the evidence lead? We're excited to have this seminar this weekend. I'm going to ask Dean if he would come up here and lead us in a prayer, and then Richard will speak to us.
Will you pray with me, please? Lord, we want to thank you for another day that you have given us. Lord, we want to thank you for the beautiful sunshine, the turning of the colors of the trees, the evidence that shows that you're in power. You're the one who created everything. Lord, help us always to keep our minds focused on you are the creator. Lord, be with Richard as he speaks to us, showing the evidence that you have shown to all of us, and he can speak to us about that evidence. Lord, as we come together, help us also to remember the ones who could not be here for whatever reason, ones who are sick, ones who are homebound. Lord, be with them. Put your hands on them. Help heal them, either spiritually or physically. Lord, there are so many people we need to be praying for that each one of us have on our minds. Please be with those people. Lord, thank you, a special thank you for Jesus. Without him, we would have no hope of being with you. Lord, I ask all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
All right. Let's see. Do we have some folks here this morning? Well, first, how's the sound check? Can you hear me good back there? Okay, excellent. We have some folks here this morning that weren't here last night. There are a few. Anybody? Okay. Let me just briefly, I'll give you some more details in a little context later, but just so you know who the heck I am. My name is Richard Walker. I grew up in Southern California. I'm a product of public schools. I was a materialist atheist up into college. I did not go to church when I was young at all. Didn't really have any interest in it either. And became a Christian, became a creationist, have been studying the science in particular, some on the theology side as well, but primarily my interest has been on the science side of things, the topics related to this issue, since really January 1976. So closing in on 38 years, long time to be studying something, but there is a wealth of information, and there's been an explosion of information about life. What we're learning in science about life is incredible. We're also learning a great deal about the universe in astronomy, but life in particular, molecular biology, and some of those subjects are just incredible. I hope to have time to show you a short video today just to give you a glimpse into some of what we're learning about what goes on inside every single living cell. So anyway, that's been my focus. And what I want to present today is sort of some foundational ideas about what's really going on here. Why do some very intelligent people be completely committed to the truth of evolution and the idea that the physical world's all there is and the Bible is just mythical nonsense? There's a lot of intelligent people who believe that. On the other side, there's some equally intelligent people who flat out believe the biblical history is fact, that there was a 6-day creation a few thousand years ago. And they're equally intelligent, they're equally aware of the science. I personally know PhD scientists in every area you can think of who are absolutely committed creationists, and they are not at all unaware of the evidence. So how is it that evidence leads people in two different directions? That's one thing we want to look at. It's really foundational to the whole idea. So this may seem a little strange to some of you if you haven't ever thought about things this way, but bear with me. It's really important. It'll really help us think things through a bit. Also, I mentioned last night, and I want to reiterate, my goal is not to tell you what to believe. Nor do I think you should let anybody else necessarily tell you what to believe. On the other hand, I will try to share with you what I believe about this subject, but also why I believe it. Try to provide some reasons for belief. And that's what you need to be challenging when you're looking at this subject or any other, but this one in particular we're talking about. Is creation a mythical story, or is it actual history? When you're looking at supposed evidence on either side of that, make them provide reasons and think about it. Be critical in your thinking. A lot of unbelievers like to call themselves skeptics. Okay? That's a word that they just love. They're skeptics. Well, I guarantee you I'm more skeptical than they are. And I'll tell you why. I'm skeptical of the claims of consensus science. And I demand evidence in that area, and they often do not. We're going to look at that, some specific things about that as well. So we have by the way, this chair is here. If you see me kind of limp over and sit down, it's because I have very bad knees. And after I stand for a while, I'll notice that I'm going to fall down soon. So if I sit down, it's not because I'm bored or something. It's just so that I can continue. Two opposing worldviews. There's people who start with God's Word as truth and go from there. And then there's people, a majority of people in Western science, Western academia in particular, that really build it on top of man's wisdom. And we'll look at what I mean by that. It's how I was educated. It's what I was very interested in. It's what I believed, and it's what I studied, was evolution. So either God created the universe, or the universe created God. To the evolutionist, the atheist evolutionist, God is simply a mythical idea that man made up to make us, it's like a psychological warm blanket. That's all it is. It's just a dumb idea that some people need to glom onto because they're psychologically weak. Okay, so the universe created God in that perspective. Let's look at it a little more closely. Materialism, also called naturalism, and it is the idea, the belief system, that the only thing that exists is matter and energy. There is nothing else. And they're governed by the physical laws of the universe. And in general, they mean, although they can't consistently stay with this, in general they mean the physical laws as they are operating now, the things we can observe in a laboratory. So we'll say, that's it, okay? That's naturalism. And that means everything, even consciousness, is simply a property of matter. So chemistry produces consciousness. Nobody can explain how, but nonetheless it has to, okay? It's a belief system. That's what I believed. The biblical worldview is very different. You have several aspects that differ completely from a materialistic worldview. One is the Bible is the revealed Word of God. The idea that God exists and that he has revealed information to us, actual, it's called propositional statements, true statements about reality have been revealed to us by God, and that's the view of what the Bible is in a biblical worldview. Let's look a little more closely here. As I mentioned, the physical universe is all there is for a materialist. The universe governed by physical laws. Man is a product of the evolution of the universe. We'll talk a little bit about the definitions, plural, of the word evolution. It's used in several different ways, and it creates a lot of confusion. We're going to talk a bit about that. But evolution actually consists of everything, all the way from the Big Bang. Suppose that's the most dominant view in Western academia, is the Big Bang is how things started. We don't have time to talk about that in detail at all today. But from that point, you then have stellar evolution, aspects how stars evolved. You have the nebular hypothesis on how planets evolve, planetary systems around stars. There's a whole lot of physical theories that involve the evolution of the objects that exist in the universe. So that's part of evolution. But then there's also biological evolution, which focuses just on life. Implications: man and the earth are in no way special. Any of you remember the phrase pale blue dot? I think there's a book and maybe even a video out. Carl Sagan liked that phrase. That was a photo of the earth from a satellite, and you could just see the earth in a stream of light. I should have got a picture of it. Here's this little blue dot, and the idea of pale blue dot was, we're just this insignificant little hunk of rock. We're the third rock from the sun, right? And that's all it is. Nothing special. There's no purpose, no design, no specialty to the earth or man at all. That's part of this belief system. And life is nothing but chemistry. That's all life is. Molecules in motion. This was the point. That part of a materialist belief was what I had a problem with eventually. When I was 20 years old, my best friend died of leukemia. He was 22. He had just turned 22 years old. And he was the only friend I had who was a Christian. That really didn't influence things much. But I watched him for 10 months deal with acute leukemia without it affecting his attitude about life. He didn't feel sorry for himself. I mean, he reacted to this in a way that made no sense to me at all. So I observed that. He actually was diagnosed in the first week of December in 1974, and we found out later the doctors did not expect him to see Christmas. He had a very rapid form of leukemia and was supposed to be dead in about 2 weeks. He wound up having a spontaneous remission for about 10 months. In other words, for an unknown reason, he survived 10 months. Medically, they had no idea why. Then in October the following year, and I saw him virtually every day in between. We were very good friends. We worked together. He worked for me while I managed a Taco Bell. Well, that was not a smart job. I quit that and went back to school, which was a much better idea. But he worked for me. We played tennis together. I had pretensions to being an athlete, which is why I have to sit in a stool now after a while. 6 knee surgeries don't do you well. And we went to school together. We actually had a topology class together the semester he died. So he was also a math major in university. And he was most likely to succeed, the best math science student in high school. Had 2 Bs all the way through high school. Everything else were As. I mean, real smart guy. Very good friend of mine. But I watched him face his own death for 10 months, go through all the effects of chemotherapy back in the early 70s, which were pretty brutal, without complaining. That really meant nothing to me. That didn't impact my worldview. It was just an observation. Then he dies. Well, death didn't impact my worldview because a bunch of my older relatives, my grandma's generation had 21 kids, and I'd been going to funerals when I was young, and so I knew about death. Plus, if you're an evolutionist, death is part of things, always has been. I mean, that's just normal. There's nothing unusual about that. That didn't bother me. But 2 days after he died, I went down to the mortuary to a viewing, I guess we'd typically call it now, and I sat in this little tiny room by myself with his body, his corpse, in an open casket in this little tiny room. And I remember sitting there looking at, and I don't know how many of you have seen a corpse. If you haven't, you won't necessarily understand this. If you have, you probably will. When you look at a dead person, it's very obvious they're not alive. There's a body there, but the person isn't there. And I sat there looking at his corpse and realized that this last bullet here says life is nothing more than chemistry, that what I had to continue to believe as a materialist was the following. The only difference, his name was Stephen, the only difference between my friend Stephen and that set of molecules in that casket, his corpse, was the chemistry's changed a little bit. Because for a materialist, that's it. That's the only difference. You are nothing but molecules and chemistry. When you die, you're still molecules and chemistry. The chemistry's changed a little, but that's it. And I sat there thinking about that, and that was no longer believable. I simply didn't believe that made any sense. And that was frightening to think about. It truly frightened me because all of a sudden I thought, do you mean it's possible there's something beyond the physical and maybe this God stuff might be real? And that was what caused me to go seek the truth. And to actually, I drove down to the beach in the dark and sat there and prayed for the first time in my life. And all I knew to pray was, if you are real, God, let me know. That was it. That was all I could pray. And he did. And from that point on, I had a different perspective on things. And I went back to school and began to apply critical thinking skills in my science classes like I had been doing in my mathematics classes, and found out they had great difficulty defending the evolutionary theories I was being taught. That got me started studying this, and I've continued for the last 3.5 decades. So that point was a problem for me. There are materialists that I've talked to and seen interviewed, that's what they believe. They themselves are nothing but chemistry. There's no such thing as a spirit. There's no such thing as a soul. You can't explain consciousness, but it must just be a property of matter somehow. And so there's really no meaning whatsoever to life. So when you die, that doesn't mean anything either. And mankind's going to go extinct anyway, and the whole universe is going to die in a heat death eventually. Everything's going to run down because of entropy, and that's the end of things. So that's a belief system that a lot of people have. Many of them haven't critically thought about it, but nonetheless they believe it. Also, science determines what's true, because the only real truth for many people is what science determines to be true. Okay? Biblical worldview is very different. It acknowledges the existence of God who transcends the universe. He's outside of space and time. He actually created the universe. He's not part of it. Okay? There are pantheistic views out there. Those are not biblical worldviews. Biblical worldview, God created the universe, but he himself is not part of it. Furthermore, he says in the Bible, which we believe is revealed truth, he created man in his image, and we have a special place in the universe. Okay? You can see these are completely different perspectives on things. And that God revealed himself through the Bible. And furthermore, man is not just material. He has a soul that transcends the material. Part of the idea of being created in the image of God. We're more than just molecules in motion. So it's a very, very different worldview. Some of the topics that the worldview impacts, well, it impacts everything, but just to mention some. Logic and philosophy, how do we know anything? Science is the study of the world around us. And there's all these different areas of science that study various aspects of the physical realm. Lots of great stuff there. But that's what science is, really the study of the physical realm. Okay? Intelligent design is an interesting and controversial subject in the last few years. And this is what intelligent design actually is. There's a lot of critics of it who mislead the public about what it is. This is what the intelligent design people themselves say it is. The theory of intelligent design holds that certain features of the universe and of living things are best explained by an intelligent cause, not an undirected process such as natural selection. Undirected meaning there is no intelligence directing it. There is no guidance. There's no plan. There's no purpose. It's simply the outflowing of physical laws operating just by themselves. Okay, that's what undirected means. So intelligent design is saying, no, sometimes when you examine things, the inference, the evidence points you to the idea that the best explanation is that there's an intelligent design behind it. And that idea, let's see if I've got that next here. It actually is familiar to us now if you watch television and watch any of the forensic shows. How many shows are on TV where people are investigating a crime scene and they're looking at evidence and they're trying to decide, is that smudge on the ground, is that just natural, just happened because of raindrops or something, or is that actually a footprint? They're examining physical evidence and saying, what's the best explanation for it? And they're including, the best explanation might be an intelligent agent was involved. That's intelligent design. But when you apply it to life itself, it gets controversial. That's why it's controversial. And there's a question of, is this legitimate science? A pure materialist, here's the thinking of a pure materialist and why they have such a problem with intelligent design. And you'll see a couple of caveats later, but it goes like this. Well, it's fine if you tell me you're examining a crime scene and you're looking for an intelligent operator behind the evidence, because I know people exist. And so, yeah, we know the potential cause of it. But if you look at a bacteria cell and you see things there that are best explained by design, the problem is, in the material realm, I don't have a designer available. That would point outside the material realm. And so, I'll just tell you that's not science, and you're going to see how that plays out as we go forward here. But that's the thought process behind it. And the real question is, what does the evidence show? We'll look at some of that today. Could a creator be known? Is there evidence for a creator around us? Here's what the Apostle Paul wrote in the letter to Rome. And the Roman culture was it had lots of pagan beliefs, anything but a Christian type worldview, no notion of an ultimate creator, lots of little gods running around doing things, fighting with each other, etc. Paul wrote this, and it's a very interesting statement. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse. And he's flat saying, if you examine the world around you, there is evidence for the attributes of God, meaning the God of Scripture. Okay? So that's a very interesting statement. If that statement's true, then we should be able to see evidence when we look around us. If materialism's true, that statement is pure nonsense. There is no evidence of it because there is no creator. So we ought to be able to examine the evidence and decide, is this statement credible or not? Here's what's going on in science. And I put science in quotes because, as you'll see, this is a redefinition of science that is going on. Literally, they're saying, here's a quote from Dr. Scott Todd at Kansas State University, published in Nature, a letter in Nature, which is one of the big science publications. And he testified at some of the court trials about intelligent design on the side that it's absolutely not science. Here's what he said. Even if all the data point to an intelligent designer, such an hypothesis is excluded from science because it is not naturalistic. Okay? So what has he done? Let's go this way. He has equated science with naturalism. He's flat equating them. That's what's going on right now in academic science in the Western world. And it's actually an attempt to redefine science. And I'll show you some of the history of science here. That is not the definition that was used in centuries past at all. I recently presented the same information to a group that happened to include a Chinese PhD neurologist who's doing research at Vanderbilt. And she took great exception to this definition of science. She goes, that's not science. And I found it very interesting. I said, in her education, even though she's from an atheist country, she had not gone so far as to say science is exactly the same as naturalism. Okay? So not all scientists believe this by any stretch of the imagination, and yet it is pushed to the public constantly as this is science. Okay? So that's a critical issue here. It also means, as Scott Todd said, science defined this way is not allowed to follow the evidence wherever it leads. You can't do that. You have to stick within naturalism, period. Doesn't matter what the data shows. You're going to see more of this as we go on. And sort of a corollary, and what's very common out there in culture now, is religion is not related to reality. Okay? Stephen Jay Gould was, most of you may have heard of him. He was one of the most published evolutionists. Paleontologist, a professor, and he created this concept that he called non-overlapping magisteria. Magisteria meaning an area of study or thought, with the acronym NOMA. And what it meant was science and religion are completely separate areas. And they don't overlap at all. They have nothing to do with each other. So you can have truths over here in religion, say, there's nothing to do with science. And you have truths in science, there's nothing to do with religion. Two distinct realms of thought, period. So don't even attempt to ever consider them together. They have nothing to do with each other. And so that thought's out there. We'll revisit that. Religious thoughts in our culture are supposed to be private only. Okay? Don't be a religious bigot and go tell people, what they ought to. I mean, you encounter this all the time. If you're going to be a good person in Western culture, you keep your religious thoughts to yourself. It's to be a private belief system. And others, a number of people have flat said, religion is the source of most of the evil in the world. Religion's bad. Any of you hear that out there? A very common statement that's out there now. Deserves study as well, but this is part of our culture now. Much of the Christian church has accepted this idea. It's amazing. Christian academia has, to a large extent, accepted this idea that religious truths are spiritual only and have nothing to do with physical reality. Okay? And perhaps even worse, a lot of Christians live like this. Religious beliefs are to be private only. So that's how they live their lives. That negates what Scripture says how Christians are supposed to live. We're supposed to be light and salt in the world and things like that, and be prepared to give an answer for people for reasons why we believe what we believe, all those kinds of things. That all gets completely negated by this view. But it's also very common right now. Now, science. If you look at the major areas of science, all the major areas of scientific study, first thing that's kind of interesting is we had a huge revolution in science as part of the Enlightenment, where all of a sudden we began to systematically study the world and figure out how things worked. And huge developments in science. And I'll show you the names of many of these people. Interesting question. Why did that approach to examining the world show up in Western culture, and specifically European culture? Why didn't it show up in Asian culture? They were actually ahead of European culture in a lot of areas of scientific thought, but they didn't develop what we call modern science. And the reason, which is even acknowledged within the secular community, they think this is a really ironic thing, okay? But it's acknowledged. The reason modern science developed the way it did was the practitioners, the foundational people that I'll show you here in a second. I think I'll go ahead and start putting their names up there. People like this. They believed the Bible. They believed in the Christian or biblical God. And that has some interesting implications. They believed the universe and the world was created by a rational creator. So they expected it to behave rationally. A foundational idea in modern science is if I do an experiment in my lab today, you can go to your lab tomorrow and repeat it, and you expect to get the same results, right? That's a foundational idea in science. That idea isn't there if you have a culture that believes the world is manipulated by a bunch of little gods that are fighting with each other, and they do whatever they want whenever they want. It's irrational. There's no reason to expect things to behave the same way from one day to the next, or from one place to the next. But a biblical worldview changes that, and you expect uniformity and regularity in the behavior of the universe. Furthermore, you expect that mankind is able to understand it because we were created in the image of God. So not only is the world rational, but man has the ability to investigate and understand it. And then there's an old idea that used to be called a dominion mandate, which was the idea that God actually gave man the task of managing this world. And so they considered science as doing what God wants it. Go investigate it. Go learn how things work. This is your world to manage. That's how these people thought. That was their worldview. And so because of that worldview, they began systematically investigating the world. And these people, none of these people had an atheist or materialistic worldview, and yet they're the foundational people in all these areas of science. And it is, like I said, it's interesting, considered an interesting, ironic idea that the foundations of science were built on top of a biblical worldview, a religious worldview, and yet science today, professionally, has nothing to do with that. It's divorced itself completely from that. None of these people would have agreed with that. But you know what the answer is? Why did these people not have the view people have today? It's because they were before Darwin. And now that Darwin has enlightened us and we have a materialistic explanation for mankind, we can get rid of those old religious trappings, and that's why these people had a false worldview, even though they were incredibly brilliant. That's the explanation that's out there among the scientific community. So the belief in Darwinian evolution is foundational to trying to transition into a materialist worldview. You've got to have an explanation for man, right, that doesn't involve a creator. Well, what if materialism isn't correct? What happens if you restrict your view, like Scott Todd said? It's not scientific if it's not naturalistic, not materialistic. What happens if you restrict your worldview like that and it turns out that it's false? Kind of like this. This guy sees, all he can see is what his materialistic magnifying glass lets him see. So he reaches a false conclusion and he misses much of reality. So this issue of, is materialism correct or not, is a hugely important question. Now, that raises another issue. Granted, most Western scientists believe in materialism. Certainly within academia, that's very true. Much more so than within the business world of science. But let's just say it's true, okay? So here's a very valid question. Does it make sense at all that the majority of scientists could all be wrong about the same thing at the same time? Is that a believable idea? And I've talked to people that I worked with, really smart engineers and things, who attempted to defend their materialistic view, really couldn't do so, and very quickly fell back on, well, that's what almost all scientists believe. So obviously it's got to be true. That's this question. Well, just look at the history of science. Here are some previously held scientific truths. There's no such thing as germs. Everybody in the scientific realm knew that the cause of disease was imbalance in blood humors. You all familiar with this? You went to the doctor in the Middle Ages. What did they do to make you well when you actually had an infection, but they didn't know what that was? They drained blood from your body, okay? That was the common scientific understanding of disease theory. When some other medical practitioners like Joseph Lister and Virchow, I think was a number of other people, started saying, well, wait a minute, we've observed something. When we operate on people, by the way, when they operated on somebody, a huge percentage of them died after the operation. It was because of infection, but they didn't know that, okay? But here's this observation. You operate on people, a lot of them die. So some other medical practitioners said, we've observed something. If we thoroughly clean the medical instruments and wash our hands and do things like that, a whole lot fewer people die after operations. Flat observation. So we are saying there's something going on here. There's something that we can't see, but there's something causing disease. And we can prevent that, or at least reduce it, by cleanliness. Well, the response from the scientific community was, you're an idiot. You mean to tell me you believe in invisible disease-causing agents? Come on. Everybody knows it's a balance in blood humors. Okay? Obviously, we now know that was completely wrong. Nobody wants to go get blood when they go, and if you have to have your appendix removed, you better hope they sterilize the scalpel, right? Russ, you'd be out of a job if they still had that worldview. He works with sterilization equipment in hospitals and biological research labs and things like that. Here's another one. Maggots are spontaneously generated from dung. That was where life came from, spontaneous generation. That was a scientifically held belief, okay? That was proven to be false by experiments. And it goes on. Aristotle and Ptolemy, I mean, they believed the sun revolved around the earth. And that belief out of Greek science, I mean, for 2 millennia, that dominated scientific thought. Matter can't be created or destroyed. That was another thought. I mean, you walk through. You can't travel faster than the speed of sound. The history of science just has all these examples where what they previously believed as fact turns out to be wrong. Actually, that's how science moves forward, isn't it? We figure out what we used to think isn't correct anymore. And now we've corrected something, we know something new, and now we're moving forward. That's what science does to progress. So the idea that just because most scientists believe it, it must be true, doesn't stand the light of investigation at all. It's a ridiculous idea. And yet, that's the primary answer most people give for why they believe evolution must be true. Most scientists believe it. They've never thought about it critically. What about consensus? This is really most scientists believing it. This is a lengthy quote, but I thought it was very well said. Everybody know who Michael Crichton is, the author who recently passed away? You all know he was an MD, right? He went to medical school. He did medical research before he quit doing that stuff to just write. So he was well educated in science. He gave a speech at Caltech, I believe in 2003. Caltech is a major technical institution. Caltech and MIT are generally considered the 2 top technical schools in the U.S. Here's what Michael Crichton said to them in a speech. He said, "Let's be clear. The work of science has nothing whatever to do with consensus. Consensus is the business of politics. Science, on the contrary, requires only one investigator who happens to be right, which means that he or she has results that are verifiable by reference to the real world. In science, consensus is irrelevant. What is relevant is reproducible results. The greatest scientists in history are great precisely because they broke with the consensus. There is no such thing as consensus science. If it's consensus, it isn't science. If it's science, it isn't consensus, period." Very well said and absolutely correct. And yet, most people accept evolution as true and the biblical history as necessarily false because consensus science says so. Okay? That's just a fact. Now, he went on. He also said, "Finally, I would like to remind you to notice, and this is really important, where the claim of consensus is involved. Consensus is invoked only in situations where the science is not solid enough. Nobody says the consensus of scientists agrees that E equals mc squared. Nobody says the consensus is that the sun is 93 million miles away. It would never occur to anyone to speak that way." Very astute observation. So if you're thinking about things, if you want to be a skeptic and you think about things, as soon as somebody resorts to saying, well, most scientists believe it, or that's the consensus view, that is a red flag. Okay? In fact, Crichton went on elsewhere, he said, if somebody invokes consensus, grab your wallet. That was what he said. But that's an important concept. So we're going to challenge consensus science. Does that mean that I'm anti-science? Absolutely not. It means I'm not buying into this idea that consensus tells you the truth. I know too much about science. I actually love science way too much to buy into that myth. Okay? I am not in any way anti-science, nor are any of the creationist scientists I know. But we are willing to challenge consensus, which is what every scientist who makes any breakthrough has done. Now, it's also claimed that, well, virtually all scientists accept the Big Bang is true and accept Darwinian evolution is true. I mean, everybody knows that, right? All scientists believe that. That statement is made so often, and I'm going to show you exactly what is in a syllabus for undergrad students at Indiana University later, okay? So don't believe this because I said it. Remember I told you that earlier? Don't believe something just because I say it. I'll show you where to go look it up. Okay? These aren't my words. But in the Big Bang area, that is so often claimed to be everybody believes it, and there's no scientists who don't believe it, that years ago a group of scientists, cosmologists and physicists, got together, created a statement that says the Big Bang isn't proven. They were dissenting from the Big Bang. You can go look up cosmologystatement.org and look at the people who signed this thing, hundreds of scientists. Okay? There's over 200 current scientists and engineers. I just looked at it the other day, about 500 total, including the independent researchers. Lots of people, very knowledgeable, don't buy it. And they put that statement out there because so often people were told everybody believes it. Okay? In the area of Darwinian evolution, there's a statement called the Dissent from Darwinism that says, the main part says this. This is all it says, is we are skeptical of the claims for the ability of random mutation and natural selection, we'll talk more about that, to account for the complexity of life. Careful examination of the evidence for Darwinian evolution should be encouraged. Would you think that would get you in trouble, saying we encourage the investigation of the evidence? Unbelievable what's happened to people's careers because they signed this statement. But there are hundreds of signers of this statement, PhD scientists. And they felt they had to make, it's a 20-page PDF file at the moment, and it keeps growing, okay? And I'm going to show you statements by one PhD chemist who signed this, what he has to say about the details. So, and there was another one. Physicians and surgeons, they've got their own separate dissent from Darwin statement that, again, you've got hundreds of people who've signed it. They're saying, don't buy into the idea that everybody believes this is true. All scientists believe it's true. That's not a true statement. So just know, anytime you encounter anybody who says, all scientists believe evolution, there's two cases. They're ignorant. They don't know the truth. These statements are out there, but they're unaware of it. Or they're aware of it and they're lying to you. Those are the only two possibilities. Okay? Or I made this up and those statements don't exist and I'm lying to you. Go look it up. Okay? Easily verifiable. This is another important topic. Can you prove something about origins? Scientifically prove it. It's impossible. Scientific proof is based on the idea of repeated experiments. You do experiments, you make observations, you're able to repeat it, you're able to challenge it, you form hypotheses, you examine the data. We cannot go back and redo the creation. We cannot apply the scientific method directly to it in an experimental way. So we cannot prove creation. And no knowledgeable creationist says you can. They all say this, okay? It's not subject. Creation's not taking place. It's not observable, not subject to the scientific method. I think I bored somebody. Sorry about that. I know some of you probably want to cry too, but you're just too old. Now, what about evolution? And again, there's multiple definitions here. What this is referring to is the evolution of different kinds of creatures, molecules to man, bacteria to bacteriologists, that type of evolution. That is said to occur so slowly it can't be observed. So it's not observed. I'm going to show you some scientific statements about this. So it also is not really subject to the scientific method. That part of evolution, that idea. This word is very slippery, means a whole bunch of things. And if you want to even think about this, be sure you know what's meant by the word evolution at the point of the discussion. So, in fact, next slide. Definitions of evolution. I'm just going to highlight two of them. Microevolution is a term that's often used, and it's referring to adaptive changes, and I put within a kind of creature, and I use the word kind deliberately because that's the term the Bible uses. It says creatures reproduce after their kind. They were created. When they reproduce after their kind. I'll show you some evolutionary tree with that idea later. But microevolution is adaptation and variation that stays within a kind. So you can have lots of different dogs, for example. We do selective breeding and get all kinds of different breeds of dogs, as an example, but they're still dogs. We can't do selective breeding and turn them into a goat or something. Okay? There's boundaries to what's called microevolution. And this is observable. Nobody questions it. So if you're told that all creationists are evolution deniers, that's another favorite term out there now. Everybody that you want to denigrate, you call them a denier. Because what does that invoke? It invokes the idea of Holocaust deniers. That was where that term was first used. And so that term is a way to attack somebody personally rather than deal with the evidence they're presenting. But creationists are called evolution deniers. Okay? Not true at all if you're talking about microevolution. No knowledgeable creationists deny this at all. A lot of them do research in these areas. Some of the most knowledgeable genetics research about what's going on within adaptation is being done by creationists. So that one, observable and nobody questions it, and we're learning a lot about it. We have no time to talk about it. There's a whole new field of study called epigenetics, which is absolutely fascinating. But we're really scratching the surface in our knowledge of what's going on within a bacteria cell, for example, any living cell. But there's another kind of evolution, macroevolution, which is that change from one kind to another. Okay? Different topic, but they use the same word, evolution. So you've got to be sure to know what you're talking about. Okay? And, like I said, bacteria to bacteriologist, never observed, but they claim, well, you can't observe it because it happens too slowly. Okay? By the way, if you can't observe it, is it part of science? You know, science is based on observation. If I can't observe it, can I say it's part of science? That's an interesting question. Here's what is claimed. Okay, it's really not understood, macroevolution. I'll show you some statements about that. But it's often claimed it's just a whole bunch of microevolution. So what we observe going on in adaptation, you know, finch beaks changing sizes on the Galapagos Islands, that type of change which we observe, that just goes on for billions of years. That explains it. It's just an extrapolation. That is an undefendable perspective. It doesn't work. And yet that's what's presented to the public all the time. And I'll show you one, that's my statement again, but I'll show you one PhD chemist who addresses that issue. Richard Dawkins also said this. Y'all know who Richard Dawkins is? He's probably one of the most visible evolutionists out there. He has best-selling books all the time. Wrote The Blind Watchmaker. I mean, he's written a whole bunch of books which were bestsellers, cost a lot of money. And he's a staunch materialist evolutionist. And he said this, it's absolutely safe to say that if you meet someone who does not believe in evolution, that person is either ignorant, stupid, or insane. Okay? And then other Darwinists like Chardin, I mean, they said evolution is a general postulate to which all theories, all hypotheses, all systems must henceforth bow. So what they're saying is, when you do science, it has to fit into an evolutionary paradigm. It has to fit into that belief system. It just dominates everything. Okay? And I mentioned this one earlier. How does that match with this statement? That's why he would make a statement like this. Doesn't matter where the evidence leads. It's not science if it's not naturalistic. That's where this mindset comes from. This is another lengthy quote, but this is from a big-time evolutionist, okay? Richard Lewontin. He was a champion of neo-Darwinian evolution, but he made this interesting statement. He's actually just making a very honest statement here. This is a very honest statement about why he believes what he believes, how science works in his view, this materialistic view. We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises of health and life, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just-so stories. Y'all know what a just-so story is? Those were stories where it just happened. No rationale given for it all. It just happened. Okay? He says science has a tolerance for these unsubstantiated just-so stories because we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism. It's not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world. That means the world we observe. Okay? So we're not forced to, but on the contrary, that we are forced by our a priori ahead of time. We've already made a commitment and adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations. No matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated, moreover, that materialism is an absolute. Look at this last part. For we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. So he's flat admitting there are unsubstantiated just so stories, absurd constructs we believe within science, but we do that because we have already made a commitment ahead of time to materialism, not because science requires it. That what you guys have all heard out there in the public? He's just being honest. Here's another evolutionist. He was reviewing Paul Davies' book. Paul Davies is an evolutionist, but he's not quite as committed to materialism. He's an interesting character. In this review, listen to what he says. Paul Davies gets into all the corners of research into the origin of life. Cynically, one might conclude that much of his vague thinking, in fact, represents the sad state of affairs in this field of research. We are nowhere near understanding the origin of life. There's a good, accurate statement. The more we learn about life, the harder the problem becomes chemically. It says, but let us try to avoid invoking miracles. It's like, for crying out loud, no matter how hard this is to understand, don't invoke miracles. That's just a materialistic worldview. And you can see it constrains what you reach for conclusions. Now, here is what is presented to undergraduate students at Indiana University in one of their classes. I went online, found this information for students very recently, like 2 weeks ago. Look at these statements. Now tell me if these give you any idea at all that there's any controversy or any question at all about evolution. Okay? Look at these statements. There are no empirical observations of life, living or extinct, that evolution cannot explain. And there is no evidence against evolution. Okay? There's also many independent lines of evidence that are consistent with natural selection as the main mechanism of evolution. There is no observed evidence against this as a working mechanism for evolution. Efforts to point out evidence against evolution always turn out under critical examination to be totally without merit. So in other words, everything I'm presenting to you is nonsense. Okay? The theory of evolution by natural selection, or more precisely, the theory of natural selection, therefore holds the high status of near certainty. It's a scientific theory. Okay? Now, if I took that class before I was critically thinking, that was pretty much the tone of the stuff I took. Well, yeah, why would I question it? Clearly, no intelligent person questions it. Dawkins says you got to be ignorant or insane. Here they tell you there's no evidence against it, and everybody who claims they have any, it's just nonsense. Well, let's see. Oh, sorry, he continues. In short, evolution as a real phenomenon is scientifically solid. It is a scientifically demonstrated fact, and the scientific theory for how evolution happens is so well documented by the evidence that this explanation is as close to a scientific fact as any explanation can be. In fact, it's often compared to the theory of gravity. If you're an evolution denier, do you deny gravity? Do you believe in a flat earth? I mean, those are the kind of statements that are out there. Well, it's understandable from this perspective. Let's take a look at an actual expert. Let's move away from what's presented to undergrads who have no science education, and let's look at an actual expert. Dr. James Tour, one of the 10 most cited chemists in the world, he's a professor at Rice University. He got in a lot of hot water, I don't know, was it about 12 or 13 years ago? He signed the Descent from Darwin document. The one I showed you earlier says we encourage investigation. He signed that. He got all kinds of criticism. He's going, what's going on here? I'm not even allowed to say this? Look at some of the things he said. This is in print. I'm not making this up. It's on his website. I will tell you as a scientist and a synthetic chemist If anybody should be able to understand evolution, it is me, because I make molecules for a living. He's an expert in the synthesis of molecules in the lab. He understands what it takes to make molecules. I simply do not understand chemically how macroevolution could have happened. Interesting statement. I don't understand evolution, and I will confess that to you. Let me tell you what goes on in the back rooms of science with National Academy members. This is the National Academy of Science. With Nobel Prize winners. I've sat with them, and when I get them alone, not in public because it's a scary thing, if you say what I just said, meaning I don't understand evolution, if you say that, I say, do you understand all of this? Where all of this came from and how this happens? Every time I've sat with people who are synthetic chemists who understand this, they go, nope, don't understand it. They'll say that privately. They don't dare say it publicly because their careers will be trashed. They just don't dare. This is now dated, so it's been more than 7 or 8 years. But he said about 7 or 8 years ago, I posted on my website that I don't understand, and I said, I will buy lunch for anyone that will sit with me and explain to me evolution. And I won't argue with you until I understand something. I will ask you to clarify. But you can't wave by and say, well, this enzyme does that. You've got to get down to the details of where molecules are built for me. Nobody has come forward. So he said, don't give me these hand-waving statements. I know too much about chemistry. And all those vague statements that are out there, they don't work. So come and explain it to me in detail. How does this really work? So it boils down to this. Evolution is understood, and he's saying this tongue-in-cheek, obviously. It's understood by those who do not understand the necessary chemistry. But those who do understand the chemistry do not understand evolution. Very interesting statement. And that is precisely what I found as soon as I began critically thinking about this whole subject. Big old broad subject. Lots of claims out there. Pick one. He's talking about the origin of life and macroevolution in particular. Pick a subject within it and dig down into depth. Give me some details about how this works scientifically. And you can't find them because they don't exist. Nobody knows. Rice is in Texas. The Texas Atheist Organization found out about this, right? Here's this professor saying, somebody come and explain this to me. They ask their members. They go, we'll pay for lunch. Somebody go down to Houston and tell this guy what's going on. Nobody goes. Nobody will sit down with Dr. Tour and explain it to him because they can't. Nobody knows how this supposedly works. And the truth is, if you dig into it, and we don't have time to go into details, if some of you are interested, contact me, and I'll show you where to look up these details. Chemistry precludes it. It's phenomenal. There's all kinds of insurmountable issues there. Some other implications of materialism. Well, if materialism is true, there are no absolute rules. I mean, how could there be? There's no lawgiver, so how do you get laws? There's nothing but chemistry, molecules and energy. That's it, okay? Now, this is unfortunate, but it's true and it's in print. Some evolutionists have said, it's okay to use some inaccuracies temporarily if they will help you reach the students. Now, remember what I showed you Indiana University presents to undergrads? Nobody questions this. They tell them about James Tour over at Rice University, one of the 10 most cited chemists in the world. They don't tell them about that. They lie to them and tell them everybody understands this. Nobody doesn't understand it. That's not a true statement. But they're saying it's okay to use some inaccuracies temporarily if it'll help you reach students. Look at this one. You cannot bludgeon kids with truth or insult their religion. They're really talking about Christian students who come into the university and are studying science. So you can't bludgeon them with it, or their parents or friends, and hope they will smile and believe you. NOMA, remember I showed you NOMA, non-overlapping magisteria, that concept that religion and science are two separate realms of thought that Stephen Jay Gould tried to promote? No, yes, NOMA is wrong, but it's a good first tool for gaining trust. So teach them NOMA. We know it's not really true, but it's a great way to get their trust. Okay? You have to bring them over to your side, gain their trust, and then hold their hands and help them step by step on that slow journey, which will be painful for many of them. It's okay to use some inaccuracies temporarily if this will help you reach the students. So evolutionists are quite willing to lie to you as a student to gain your trust and get you to believe evolution. But from their worldview, if they're a materialist, why not? They're not, I mean, it's not like they're incoherent. They're simply acting consistent with their worldview. When I was a materialist, why shouldn't I lie to somebody if it serves my purposes? Now, I will admit, I had these nagging little thoughts, sort of a conscience under there that I just suppressed. They were there. That's another whole evidence that people talk about. But from my worldview, what in the world is wrong with it? Why not? So this is nothing but, this is an outcome of the implications of a materialistic worldview, and it is in use in teaching people about evolution. Okay? And this sounds, and I dislike the fact that this sounds like I'm attacking those people. I'm not trying to do that. I'm just trying to tell you they're behaving consistent with their worldview. Okay? There's a lot of really nice people that are materialist evolutionists. Really intelligent, really nice. Within that worldview, they're just being consistent. Okay? The question is the worldview correct? Does it really work? And there are several problems within that worldview.